Welcome back to Photo 7 Motorsports, and this week we're back to the project that you've all been waiting for, and finally it's the right way up. We're back to Veronica. Now we've had a lot of new faces to the channel since we last did a proper video on Veronica, so let's do a little recap to get you back up to speed on where we are. This is Veronica, and those who know me might recognise this car a bit more when it's at the side of the road with the bonnet up. Long story short, I haven't had a very good history of reliability with this car, but finally we're getting it all sorted. Veronica is a 1984 Volkswagen Golf Mark II, and being in 1984 makes her the very first year of production in the UK. They originally came out in 1983 in Germany and Europe and so on and so forth, but in UK 1984 was the magic year. The diesels actually were introduced a little bit later in the UK than the petrol models, and this one was built in July of 1984, and she's one of the oldest surviving, let me get this right, one of the oldest surviving 1984 base spec Mark II Golf diesels, and probably the only one left that's a Gambia red of that year. So it might be a bit of a stretch, I know, but that makes her kind of special and definitely worth saving. So in one of our previous videos called Killing the Unkillable, I managed to have a catastrophic breakdown on the way down the road when I was moving house. Yes, moving house. The thing is, this is a 1984 car, yes, and to some of you the idea of daily driving a classic car is probably stupidity, but yes, ideally every classic car I have, so it's important to me that they are bulletproof and reliable, and neither of those things ever bloody happened to me apart from in the Mazda and the Subaru and the new Mercedes, to be fair. But anyway, we're digressing here. So yes, one fateful trip home from Belfast when I was moving house, the engine mount on the front of this sheared. Now they changed the design of the engine mount on the front of the Mark II to the round hockey puck style in 87 or 88, I think, I'm not sure which year for definite, but they changed it because this kept happening. Unfortunately, the original engine mount on this lasted all the way from 1984 until 2020, and it just had enough. So the engine mount sheared, the whole engine fell forward, it ruptured the oil filter, oil went everywhere over the motorway, and the engine was dead in seconds. Thankfully I got to the side of the road and it was recovered and so on and so forth. But yes, that was the end of the 1.6 turbo diesel that was in it before. Which, yes, wasn't the original engine either, because she's a 1984 base spec diesel, they didn't come with turbos, blah 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 blah. Anyway, so the AA took me home and took Veronica home, and we started to think, right, what the hell am I gonna do here? What am I gonna put into it? And what was going to be a simple, change the engine for another one the same and be done with it, turned into, why don't I just put a TDI into it, which would make it a bit better, which then turned into, I should probably look around the car and make sure it's actually worth doing it to first, which then turned into 2 chassis legs, 2 floor pans, and probably still more welding work to be done, but that's all still to come. Anyway, long story short, over a year later from initially deciding to start the project, we are back on 4 wheels, which is a huge deal. Now this was no simple task. It involved putting in 2 floor pans, as I said, 2 floor pans, 2 chassis legs, the whole back section and a rear valance. It had all just completely rotted away. And since we're putting in the TDI and putting up to 130 horsepower and a lot of torque, it needs to be fit to take the power. And if it's stone rotten, then it's just gonna disintegrate or flex itself to death. Basically, it'll be a death trap. So after a lot of work, finally, the car is rock solid underneath. I mean, immaculate. There's not one speck of rust anywhere on the underside of the car. Now there are 1 or 2 bits up top, which can be sorted at any time now because they're up top, so I'm not too worried about that. For now, it's time to get cracking on with the conversion. Now this series was created as a kind of how-to guide with converting, and it began with stripping the car down completely, which you can check out on our channel. Then it went on to talking about the differences in the electrical systems, and then most recently, because it was relevant even though it was actually on the Blue Golf, it was still relevant to this one as well, we talked about immobilizers. But now we have a lot more interesting things to talk about. Interesting if you're into Mark II Golfs. I get this might be a bit confusing to our followers who are only interested in Mercedes or the Jag or the T4 that we sold and haven't told anybody yet. But I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible and actually explain what the things do as well as what the conversion will be, because then people who are watching this will just learn a bit more about cars in general. You don't necessarily have to want to learn about a TDI swap. This will just teach you a little bit about how cars in general work. So since we're now back on the ground, it's time to move to the front. Right, so this is a Mark II Golf, and the donor car of this is a Mark III Golf. The Mark II Golf was from 1984 to 1992. The Mark III was from 1992 to 1998, I think. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions going around about what you can and can't fit to a Mark II from a Mark III. Hopefully, I will clear some of this up. But here is what we are running at the front of the car. First of all is the subframe. Now, what is a subframe? The subframe, as it implies, is a frame or cradle that holds basically all of the front end of your car. It holds your steering rack, it holds two mounts for the engine and gearbox, it holds your wishbones, basically everything at the front end of the car related to driving bolts to the subframe as one unit. And that unit bolts onto the car as one complete section. Now on this Mark II build, we are going to use the subframe from a Mark III. What's the reason for that? Well, for the most part, the subframe on a Mark II and a Mark III are identical, apart from, and this is a key difference, the engine mounts. The Mark II has a 3-bolt engine mount. The Mark III has a 1-bolt engine mount. And for the guys like Fabulous Engineering and I think Darkside Developments and things like that who make engine mounts for this swap, they tend to ask you to have a Mark III subframe because it makes it easier lining up the bolt holes. But on this build, we are going for the Mark III subframe with the 2 Mark III engine and gearbox mounts. We are also using Mark III wishbones, steering rack, track rods, and ball joints. Now, here's where some differences come in, and I'm going to explain them. I may have explained it before, but I'm going to explain it again just to reiterate the point. There are differences in Mark III Golfs called wide track and narrow track. And basically, some people say wide tracking your Mark II is better for handling, and that may be. But what is the actual difference? Well, on a wide track, the wheels poke out ever so slightly more to give it a wider stance. Think of it as a tripod. You have your 3 legs at the bottom, and if you have it really, really narrow, it can kind of be a bit unstable. If you spread the legs out a bit, it's a bit more rigid and it's harder to push over. The same concept is true for cars. If you have a wider track, the wheels sit further out, which is a bit more comfortable on the ground. Now, a lot of people, common misconception, think that all Mark III is a wide track and you can only put Mark III stuff onto a Mark II if you want to wide track it. That's not true. The only wide track Mark IIIs are those with 5 studs. And those are 5 studs that hold on your wheels. If you have 5 bolts holding on the wheels, it's a wide track Mark III. This, as far as I'm aware, is only on GTIs and VR6s. But the lower models, which is what the TDIs were, they come with 4 stud wheels, and they are the exact same as a Mark II. Hence, we have all Mark III parts fitted to this Mark II, and it's not going to be wide tracked. So this means that Veronica here is going to be a power steering model, and it's all Mark III parts. As we said before, we're keeping it all the same Mark III, so if anything is to break in any of these, we know we can just go for the Mark III stuff and there's no confusion regarding, oh, did I use this or did I use that or what car is that off? The next thing at the front is brakes. Now, I don't care what anyone says, if you upgrade a vehicle's power, you must upgrade its ability to stop. It's one thing to get up to speed, and it's great, but it's a hell of a lot scarier if you can't get stopped again. Now with Veronica being a base spec diesel, she had the teeniest, tiniest little brakes that you could get on a Mark II. A common upgrade here would be to go for a GTI setup or to take what is on the Mark III. The only thing is though, you are going to have to change your hubs. This is down to how the hubs and calipers are designed. On these bigger brakes here, which are from a Mark III, you need to change the hubs as well because these bios here bolt on to a brake carrier and then the caliper goes on to that. I'm sure there's a reason for it, I'm not sure. I'll put it down at the bottom of the screen if I can find out what it is, but it does mean there's a different setup. Now because we are going to be going for 130 brake here, horsepower that is, it's very important that we get bigger brakes. So these are, I think they're 239mm. They may be bigger, I'll write it down below, but they are also going to have vented discs. What are vented discs? Basically, you have standard discs which are solid, or you have vented discs. You also have vented and grooved and drilled and grooved and all the rest. That's not important right now. Basically, when you brake, brakes get hot, especially if you brake hard, sudden, or are on a track and frequently. And as they get hot, your brakes actually fade. That's what's known as brake fade. You put your foot in the pedal and not as much happens anymore, and it's pretty scary. So in an attempt to reduce brake fade, you would get vented or slotted or whatever discs. The way this works is, instead of having one solid disc, which is just one big chunk of metal and they're heavy as fuck, these have a groove in the middle. Basically, as you brake, air can get into these vents or grooves or whatever you want to call them and cools down the brake quicker, which increases brake performance and longevity and all the rest. So we've opted for the bigger vented discs on this setup to make sure we can stop just as well. What you can also see here is, I think I'm touching it, maybe I'm not. Anyway, the shock. The shocks and springs we are fitting from a Mark III as well. They are new units, but they're from a Mark III. We will be going coilovers eventually so we can lower it, but just to get it moving for now, she's sitting on Mark III. Same as with basically everything else on the Mark II, the Mark III shocks are a direct fit, as are the springs. However, there are two different types of top mount, which is the bio at the top there, which is what actually secures it to the car. There are two different types of top mount depending on whether you have an early or a late Mark II. You can actually put either or on, it's up to you. I've converted this one to later style ones, but it's just a heads up that there are different types. You can reuse the ones from a Mark III. I think it gives you a bit more comfort. But yes, that's your brakes in a nutshell. There are obviously a lot more conversions and things you can do if you want to make them bigger and better. You can look into that somewhere else if you want to, and keep things nice and simple. Now, as I'm sure you can probably imagine, I'm really rather proud of this. This is the inside of Veronica, and when this project started, basically none of this was actually here anymore. After an awful lot of work, we are solid. Now, it needed 2 floor pans, a rear chassis leg, and this whole back valance welded on. With that all done, the floor was buffed back, any little bits of surface rust taken care of, protected with epoxy primer and etch primer and all the rest. This build is not to be a show car. This is going to be a daily driver for hopefully the same length of time it's already been around for now. So if I get another 40 odd years out of it, I'll be very happy. So next up was soundproofing, and to make this thing a bit more elegant than your average clattery old noisy Mark II Golf, we did some research online into ways to reduce the noise and to soundproof it and refine it a little bit more. So to begin with, we installed what's known as bitumen soundproofing sheets. Now, you may have seen videos of this stuff before, and we've used it in the past to good results. What is it? Really sticky, tarry, black substance with a silver, aluminium, or aluminum if you're from America, which a lot of our guests are. Guests? Viewers. Anyway, and it's self-adhesive basically, and you stick it on to your panels. A little bit of an introduction to soundproofing. Now, the principle behind putting this stuff onto the car is that it reduces the amount of vibrations. Cars consist of big pieces of metal, believe it or not, and your floor tends to be long, flat pieces of metal, and the longer and bigger a piece of metal is, the more it vibrates a little bit as you're driving, especially on a clattery old loud diesel, which vibrates the entire car into smithereens. The way these soundproofing pads work is, these sandwich onto the metal and dull down some of the vibrations. That's why you can tell the difference between a car that does have lots of soundproofing and one that doesn't. When you close the door of, say, a Suzuki, or I don't know why I picked Suzuki, some random small Econo box, it's very tinny sounding. You tap along it and it doesn't make a lot of sound. If you close the door of, say, a Golf, or, well, maybe a more modern Golf, but if you close the door of a Golf or a Mercedes or a BMW or any type of higher class vehicle, it makes a very different sound, and that is because of the amount of weight. It's also why you have very heavy doors and things like that, because they fill them full of soundproofing. And you can hear the difference. For example, there's no soundproofing in this part, okay? You hammer it, it's very tinny. But if you hammer inside where I've placed the soundproofing sheets, very different tone. Have I got paint on me? No, I haven't. Basically, it's a very different tone, and the sound rings a lot less. Or resonates? I think resonates is the term. Anyway, so you would kick on these soundproofing sheets to add a bit of weight to each panel, reduce the vibrations, therefore reduce the noise. It's also why you get like an echo effect, and a lot of recording studios have these big massive sheets of like black stuff on the walls. It's to reduce the echo, vibrations, blah blah blah. Because after all, sound consists of vibrations. It vibrates in your ears. That you don't need to get a biology lesson from me. Anyway, that's how it works. Now, one thing that's very important to think about when it comes to soundproofing is what's known as the rule of diminishing returns. Now, on average, I think they say it's best to cover, 25 to 40% of a panel, because anything over that, the human ear can't pick up those vibrations anyway, so you're spending more money on parts that you don't need to spend. So anything more than 40% of a panel, don't bother. I went a little bit overboard in the back. I maybe completely kicked the whole thing in soundproofing just to make sure, but the back of a car is actually what causes the most noise, because when you think about it, your boot is empty, and those rear shock tower things, your rear arches, that's the biggest point of noise in any vehicle. So I would completely cover them and then just go for 40% of the rest of your floor panels. So how do you apply this stuff? Well, it's quite simple, and when you buy them, I got them from Amazon. You can also get a little roller. I would get that because that just makes life so much easier. Now, you can cut them to shape with scissors or whatever, or a blade. What I tend to do is get a rough design with a blade and then cut it properly with scissors. But before you take off the protective layer, place it down to where you want it to go. Try and curve it into the shapes that you want and try and form it a little bit. And then make sure you don't cover any holes. For example, the holes where the rear seats come in, I flattened it all out and then pushed those holes through with a screwdriver to make sure the holes are still visible. And one key thing to remember is if you don't get it completely flat, you might as well not put it there at all. It needs to adhere really, really well to the surface. So clean the surface with panel wipe or whatever your chosen rubbing alcohol of choice is, and no dirt, no debris, it won't stick to any of that. But clean the surface really, really well, stick it down, get your roller, roll along it, and get it as flat as possible. A lot of them have grooves and shapes on them already, and these are designed so that you know when you have done it flat, because if you roll it, it smooths them out completely flat. It's a handy way that a lot of them do it, just so you can tell you've done it properly. It is time consuming, but I promise it is worth it. There is one kind of downside to it, and that is weight. Now, obviously the whole concept of this is adding weight to your floors to try and get rid of some of the sound vibrations, but they are heavy. So because I'm bringing this up to 130 brake, with the amount of soundproofing stuff I'm putting into it and all of the layers of rust proofing and underguard and stuff like that, it's probably still gonna feel like a 90 brake realistically, but hey ho, it's worth it. But yes, one thing you need to remember is that these soundproofing sheets aren't a one-stop shop. Now, if you want to get the best possible performance from your soundproofing, you need to then fit underlay. Now, you can go the reasonably priced to expensive way, or the really cheap and kind of scummy looking way, but you don't see the stuff anyway, so it's really up to yourself. If you're doing a professional build, maybe go for the really good stuff. If you're like me and you're just a hobbyist and you just want a bit more refinement, go with the cheaper stuff, but I'll explain the differences anyway. So over the top of your bitumen pads, you need stuff called closed cell foam. I think that's what it is. High density foam, I think it's closed cell foam. Basically, this is a waterproof substance that goes over the top, and it's kind of like underlay carpet in your house, which is why I used carpet underlay myself, but you know, that's the cheap and scummy way to do it. But basically, the soundproofing sheets remove the vibrations and the echo, and the foam gets rid of the drone. Now, things like tire noise, exhaust sound, and just the general road noise that you hear, the closed cell foam is what gets rid of that. So if you want to really, really soundproof your car, you need to go for both. I did it with carpet underlay for the house. You can get this much, much cheaper than the closed cell foam. It's not fully waterproof, so you know, choose carefully. That I have warned you now, it's not waterproof, and if it gets damp or wet, it will stick. I will be replacing every seal on this car, so it will be bone dry by the time I'm finished. So I'm taking the risk. It's up to yourself, and I'm not responsible for if you rot your floors through, but bear that in mind. But yes, you can do it with carpet underlay for your house, which you can probably get cheap from your local hardware store. They might even have offcuts or something and give it to you real cheap. That's what we did. Our local hardware store had some offcuts and were more than happy to help us out. So basically, same concept as the soundproofing pads. You just set it down, use a marker and cut it to the shape that you want. Cut it with scissors, and then you'll be using what's called spray adhesive. I haven't done this yet, but there's lots of guides I'm sure on how to use spray adhesive. But I'll be spray adhesiving it down and making sure it's, well, good. So that basically is the extent of the soundproofing. So hopefully you learned a thing or two about soundproofing from that. That may have been useless to you and you may not care, and you're probably thinking, this is a TDI video, I don't care about how to make my car quiet. We're restoring a car here. It all adds up. So hopefully that was a nice little reintroduction to the Veronica project. In the next episode, we're gonna get down and dirty with probably the most complicated part of the whole swap. And as you can see here, we've already got a start on it, and it's actually mostly finished. So I'm gonna talk you through it in the next episode, and that is wiring. Yes, I know there's been a couple of episodes where I've talked about wiring and stuff, but now we actually have it in the car, and I can tell you about what you need, what you can cut out, what you don't need, so on and so forth. It's going to be complicated, not gonna lie, unless you're actually doing this swap. A lot of it might go over your head, and that's fine. But I'll try and explain some of the basics as I go along and keep it as simple as possible. Yes, I've just realised I forgot to actually say good luck and all the rest in the end of that. So I've had to record yet another section in the back of the Mk2 van here, because that's where I'm currently editing. Don't ask. But anyway, if you've watched this far, thank you very, very much for watching. We really appreciate every single person that watches our channel and all the comments that we get. We read them all. It really means a lot to us. We really appreciate it. Remember to follow me on Instagram at tamo.pattison. Follow Connor on Instagram at Hughes Corporation. And follow Chrissy on Instagram at Chrissy Ewens. We'll see you in the next one. Subscribe if you haven't already, and good luck.